Well, hello, furniture people. I'm Joe, and I like refinishing old furniture. Somehow I decided it'd be a good idea to film that and share it, so here we are turning grit into gold. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. Doing that allows me to continue sharing interesting projects with you. And with that, here I have begun work on a 1920s speaker cabinet, radio cabinet. It's something that's been around the house for quite a long time, and in fact, I believe that uh, my wife obtained this from her home growing up. And as you can see, it's obviously probably about 100 years old, maybe 1920s, 1930s. There was no speaker remaining in it. It was just the cabinet. And in particular, on the front, the scroll work where there would have been fabric, and then the speaker behind the fabric, you can see that's just a light plywood and is in pretty distressed condition. And I think I came up with a pretty interesting thing to do with it. You will see later in the video. So the first thing that I did is, again, protecting myself and my family. I went in and I did a lead-based paint test on it, and it turned up negative. And I generally prefer sanding to using a stripper if I don't have to use a stripper. Sometimes I'll use that on the edges and, maybe the edge, something like what is here right now if I can't get a sander into the groove. But this piece was pretty easy to work with, cleaned up. There wasn't much holding that old varnish together anymore. So I stuck with that and stayed away from the goopy stuff. This piece is interesting too, and as you'll see the top and the sides, and particularly after I stained it, I think that this was made out of at least 3 or 4 different kinds of wood. And I based that ultimately not necessarily so much on what it looked like when it was after I sanded it and in its sanded state, but in particular after I stained it. Um, some of the legs, they look dramatically different. And if they were all the same type of wood, I wouldn't necessarily expect that. But they're lighter or darker didn't come out quite consistent with one another. And then in particular, the top. And as I get to that, you'll see what I'm talking about more. And here going to the different types of wood, this is the top in its sanded state. And you can see 3 of the pieces of wood that make up the top have kind of a greenish hue, almost like a poplar. And then 2 of them look more like an oak. Um, and it, and again, this also happened with some of the legs where they just had a different color. Again, particularly after I stained, it was more outstanding here. And I took this through a 2-step process because originally I wanted a lighter stain overall, but particularly on the right here. You can't see it so much on the other two, but over on the right it still had a little bit of a green hue to it. And we'll come back to the final result on that too. Here I am working on the interior, and you can see what poor condition this is in. And what I'm building here is basically a frame for epoxy resin. Those are the two side walls. And now I'm installing first parchment paper and then a board to back it. The two side walls will remain in. The backer board and the parchment paper will come out. Why parchment paper? Because epoxy resin doesn't stick to parchment paper. So taping it up now, making sure it's all secure, trying to eliminate as many leakage points as I possibly could, because eventually this will be flipped. Right now it's on its face. It'll be flipped on its back so that I can put the epoxy resin in. This is the first time that I've worked with epoxy resin. I've been interested in it for a while. Didn't really have any projects to work on it with. It's a very simple mix. Um, the resin and the hardener in equal amounts. Stir them together very thoroughly for several minutes, and then pour them into whatever you're working on. Wear gloves because this stuff is very sticky. And here I am preparing to do my first pour. You can see it going on. That's the other side of the parchment paper. And I did this essentially really in two layers. The first layer came up to approximately the bottom of that damaged scroll work. And this shot in particular, you can see what kind of condition it's in. There was no way that I would have to cut it all out, try to reproduce it. And rather than do that, I thought, why not try and preserve it in the epoxy resin? And that first layer hardened overnight. I've changed the camera angle here, but here I'm coming in for the second layer. And eventually this will encase all of that damaged scroll work. There you can see pouring right over the top of it, as well as around to the edges of the trim work on the piece. I brought it, it's probably a 1/16 of an inch higher, um, just so it meets up there towards the back of the shot. You can see where it's meeting. And the two metal rails running over the top are holding in a piece of wood that I used essentially to dam the the piece on the right hand side of the frame. You can just see a little bit of the piece of wood that I'm using there in the lower right hand corner. Then when you're working with epoxy resin, to get bubbles to come out of it, you can use a couple of methods. You can use a heat gun like I'm doing here. You can also use a torch flame. In my wood shop, I don't really want to use a torch flame, so I opted for the heat gun. And you can't really see it here, but there's tiny little shadows that will appear as the resin warms up a little bit, and it helps bubbles to come up out of the top of it. And it actually worked quite nicely. And here we are now with the finished product. And you can see after I peeled away the parchment paper, it left a texture on the back, which is fine. And now this has been retasked from an old speaker cabinet into a wine rack. And I can tell you, Eddie was pretty pleased with it. Stay safe and be healthy, everyone.